Thank you. Next question. Please explain the difference between coal bed methane drilling and hydrofracking in shale. And is the former applicable to hydrofracking?
Okay, coal bed methane is similar. It's a close cousin of shale bed methane. In the coal bed methane, the methane is stored in the coal and it's released when you pull water out from above it. So basically you put in a well and you pump the water out of the well. You get usually fairly large volumes of water, and then the methane in the coal is released. In order to help the methane get released, in some places like the Raton Basin and the San Juan Basin, these are out west, hydrofracking can be done to break the coal up a bit more. But it's the release of the pore pressure on top by the column of water on top of it that gets the methane out. In the case of shale bed methane, the methane's locked in the rock itself. It's dry, hard rock. All right, and to get that out, you have to crack the rock apart into a very fine network of cracks, which allows the methane to come out. Some water comes out with it. The water that you put down, the frack water comes out. And if the fracks actually get a little bit above the Marcellus into the overlying formations, there's some also natural brines, these saline waters that can bleed in. So that's basically the difference. In one case, you have a column of water keeping the methane in the coal. You drop the column of water, and you can produce, in Wyoming, enormous volumes of water. I mean, the volumes of water produced by the Marcellus is a pittance compared to in Wyoming. When I looked at the Powder River Basin for the National Academy, I actually did the only economic analysis of my life, and I wrote in the book that we produced that if they sold the water they got from the coal bed methane in Wyoming, they'd make more money than from the methane itself, because it's a water-poor region, and the quality of the water is good enough for a lot of beneficial use, not all of it. So I hope I explained it. They're cousins of each other. And hydrofracking is used in both, but not as much in the coal bed methane, because coal is a pretty soft rock, and whereas the shale is very hard when it's thousands and thousands of feet deep. So you have to break it up in order to get the methane out.
Thank you.
So I agree with most of what Don said. The major differences between developing gas and coal bed methane and shale. Generally speaking, much shallower formations for coal bed methane. Generally speaking, much lower pressures necessary. Certainly no high volume hydraulic fracturing from 2-mile long laterals. So totally different from the engineering and technology point of view, but conceptually the same. However, I do beg to differ about the characterization of the gas that's in shale. One of the most unfortunate aspects of this whole issue is the misnaming of it as fracking. Yeah, I like all the signs and all that, but it's the wrong word. It's not fracking, it's refracking. Don mentioned the decline curve, this exponential decay very rapidly of the amount of gas that comes out of a well per unit time. There's a fundamental reason for that, and that is the gas that's in the shale is not, the gas that comes out initially is not the gas in the shale. It's the gas in the fractures that are already in the shale. So the purpose of the hydraulic fracturing process is mostly to open up existing fractures, because that's where most of the initial gas is stored. In fact, some of the fractures that are down there, 350 million years old, 6,000 feet down, under 10,000 pounds per square inch, the fractures are still open, and they're storing vast quantities of gas. And that's what we're seeing during the hydraulic refracturing activity.
Thank you. Next question. If renewable energy means solar and wind, how should these sources be backed up or supplemented, as obviously both are intermittent? And when do you think wind and solar would be significant? To the point, I assume they mean, to the point where it would be mass production, we'd be able to do it relatively cheap cost.
Wonderful nested set of questions. So the implication is, as you probably know, if the sun doesn't shine, you don't get solar. If the wind doesn't blow, you don't get wind. But that's not necessarily true when you look at solar and wind from a systems point of view, connected to a smart grid. So certainly the electricity that's running these lights right now is not necessarily coming from the nearest coal-fired power plant. Do you know where it's coming from? Does it matter? If you have a very smart grid that's capable of distributing and or storing fossil-free, sustainable, green energy, then this issue is not so important. So we should stop thinking about, when we think about solar and wind, as there's a solar panel on my roof, there's one wind generator outside here. Think of it as an integrated system that involves not just solar and wind, but also some nuclear and also some natural gas, but certainly not any coal, and some hydro, and some of all the other exotics that are going to be coming along. So we got to get much smarter about a menu, an arrangement of energy sources, because there is no one source. For the last 200 years, we've been living on fossil fuels, coal, then oil, and gas. And that's all got to go away in our grandchildren's lifetime. So we can't get in that same boat where we're always going to be relying on only one thing. Integrated, wide portfolio of energy sources, such that even if the sun isn't shining here, the lights will still go on.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I was at the Geological Society of America meeting last year, and I heard the leading climatologists in America, the ones who wrote the IPCC document, say that the time we have to rethink how we look at energy, and we have to think about adaptation to climate change and forget about mediation any longer. That is, using alternative energies. Why did they say this? It stunned the audience. They said it because the horse is out of the barn and won't be put back, the horse meaning fossil fuels. And he said that in a nation where only 43% even think the climate is warming, let alone warming caused by humans, there will never be the political will to do what I agree should be done with Tony, to generate a multifaceted energy base. Recently, the Department of Energy proposed a very large solar network in the American Southwest to fuel the southwestern energy grid. And immediately, enormous amount of resistance came up. Whenever I hear of the mention of large-scale wind farms near communities, an enormous amount of resistance. When I hear of a new nuclear power plant going up or suggested, enormous amount of resistance. Until the American public recognizes there is no risk-free energy, and we all have to take responsibility for it, the kind of integrated renewable energy that Tony would like to see, and it's got to start in America, will simply never happen, and surely not in the political climate that we have today. And so my colleagues in the climate game regrettably say we need to look at adaptation and no longer worry about mediation.
Thank you. Next question. The DEC estimate that there are 40,000 undocumented abandoned gas wells in New York State. Each of these is a proven conduit of gas and liquid through our aquifers to the surface. How do we prevent the unintended consequences, migration from new wells through these quote-unquote ticking time bombs, and who would pay for this?
How many did he quote?
40,000.
40,000?
It's also from the DEC as well as the PALMERTOU. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right. Palmerto Group?
Yeah. Well, that obviously is an issue. And I would expect, I mean, if I were the DEC, is before I allow leases to go in, to try to find where these old gas wells might be. And in fact, I suspect if there are, in fact, are that many, there will be an accident that will happen, and then we'll be able to assess the extent of which that would actually cause the kind of harm that's suggested. That's all I could say. You know, I think that there's been sufficient a number of successful gas wells that have been drilled that it suggests to me the problem won't be as acute as the questioner suggests it be.
Thank you.
We'll disagree on this one.
Yeah, we're going to disagree on this one. So, the 35 to 40,000 abandoned wells in New York State, we don't know where they are. So the first question is, if you're going to go in and do intense development of this type that I showed you, where you have compulsory integration that allows very large areas to be developed, the probability that you're going to run into one of those abandoned wells starts going up. So what's the responsibility? Figure out where they are. You can't do it by paperwork. There was no paperwork. They're lost. We don't know where they are. So seismic investigations must be a part of the requirement. 3D, state-of-the-art seismic investigations on every single new well drilled in New York State has to be a regulatory requirement, has to be part of the permitting process. I hope it will be in the SGEIS. Has such an incident occurred? Anybody who wants to know, I'll send you the URLs of an incident that occurred in November of last year in southern Texas. A well was being drilled and fracked, and presto voila, 75 feet from the head of that well, a geyser occurred, which blew for about a week. And the Texas Railroad Commission, which is in their version of our DEC, said, wow, we've never seen that happen before. So yeah, those wells, by the way, could be as many as 100 years old in New York State, 150 years old, the cement's gone, the casing's rusted out. So they're a danger. We need to find out where they are by proper pre-drilling investigation using state-of-the-art seismics.
Thank you. Would you endorse a call for routine isotopic fingerprinting in cases where people feel that the newly arrived methane in their water has migrated from drilling activities?
Great question. But let's go back to the heart of the matter. Without proper baselining of a landowner's water supply, that is, what was there well before any activity in the region began, anything that happens after that in terms of he did it, it's not my fault, just becomes an argument among lawyers. That's what's happening in Dimmock right now. Of those 18 landowners, only about a handful had pre-drilling water well testing. And you know what they tested for? Coliform bacteria. So now the lawyers are having a field day, making a lot of money, screaming at each other and yelling at each other, and eventually people are going to get sued and money's going to flow back and forth, but no good science was done. So the answer to your question is isotopic fingerprinting is an important element of a potential pointing the finger at correctly where a potential methane migration or other migration into a well water or into drinking water came from. But without proper baselining, it's useless. It can be argued in court till the cows come home. So proper baselining has to start well before any activity starts in the region. It has to be done periodically, before, during, and after. This costs money. Should the landowner who has been compulsorily integrated be forced to pay out of his or her own pocket for such testing? I don't think that's fair. It should be part of the bill that the gas company pays.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that background information absolutely needs to be done. And my understanding that it will be done in New York, from what I hear the discussions are in New York, in Albany regarding the new DEIS. And actually I think the isotopic fingerprinting would be very useful too, because you not only get biogenic methane, that's the methane produced by bacteria in wetlands and other organic rich environments, the kind of stuff in a lot of our guts right now actually. And then also we have the thermogenic methane that's produced in hydrocarbon producing regions. And you can get thermogenic methane actually fairly high up, closer to land surface as well in places. So I suspect people in this room who have homeowner wells, those who live in the rural area and have wells, my guess everyone here who has wells like that are drinking methane of some kind. Not a lot, don't worry about it. I drank it in Saratoga in my well when I was a kid. So yeah, I think background would be absolutely fundamental. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you comment on the effectiveness of wastewater treatment plants on treating frack water, both quantity and quality, e.g. high levels of dissolved chemicals in it?
Well, I'd rather not have them do it. Okay. I mean, the main constituents that are of concern are, well, the high salinity is is a concern. And you don't want to discharge water with high salinity and slugs into rivers and streams or lakes. And so they're not set up necessarily to treat a lot of the chemicals that might be coming out in flowback water. So I would like to see us get away from treatment completely of that kind and go for reuse or reinjection, as Tony said. I find it stunning that New York State won't re-inject these fluids or other toxic fluids into deep saline aquifers, much as is done in Ohio and elsewhere. I find it even equally stunning that New York is considering sequestering carbon dioxide by re-injecting that into the deep aquifers, but they won't re-inject fluids that are far less difficult to handle than supercritical carbon dioxide. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy here. So no, I wouldn't like to see sewage treatment plants handle this stuff. I think it should all be reused.
Thank you.
There's a little confusion about recycling going on. It's been going on for a couple of years now when the industry decided to invent it. Recycling was never talked about in any of the other shale plays in the U.S. before Marcellus in Pennsylvania. Look in the data, look in the information. You won't find any mention of recycling beyond a few researchers at Texas A&M who saw the problem in the future. So recycling has two forms. You can either, the word we use today, reuse some of the flowback fluid by slightly filtering it and then diluting it with more fresh water and injecting it into the next frac stage. And then you repeat that process for the next frac stage, next frac stage, next frac stage. As you can imagine, that takes certain infrastructure. New kinds of tankage, new kinds of pumps, new kinds of valves, new kinds of chemistry, new kinds of people to make sure it's all working well chemically. The end of the problem is you still are left with the stuff that comes back up the last frac stage. So reuse does not completely eliminate flowback. Reuse also only occurs during the first few weeks of flowback. As you've heard, these wells are supposed to last and produce for the landowner and the gas company for decades. Once the company leaves the site, the stuff that comes back up is not going to be reused. It gets collected in a 1,000-gallon barrel, and a truck comes along every week and takes it someplace. Where it takes it is going back to the problem we have right now. It can't go to publicly owned wastewater treatment plants. They're not equipped. It can't go to industrial plants. We don't have enough of those in New York. And we have 2 licensed injection wells in New York. Where is it going to go? Big mystery.
Thank you. The gas companies claim that they do not pollute water or air. How are we supposed to believe that when the gas companies spend large amounts of money to exempt themselves from clean water and clean air laws?
I'm first on that one?
You're first on that one.
Wow. I don't know where to start on this one. You would think by now that what was voiced by a very prominent person in the oil and gas industry at a recent prominent oil and gas conference out in Denver would have been absorbed by the PR entities in the oil and gas industry, which is that the current PR isn't working. To continue to say that we're not exempt, but we're really exempt, but even though we're not really exempt and we are exempt, we're still not going to tell you what we do exactly. It's really hard to handle that. So I think that what you're going to see in the future is the industry coming around, and as some companies have done, attempted, not completely yet, to be more transparent, more forthcoming. And I would hope that as a result of the ongoing, hopefully to be completed in the next 2 or 3 years, EPA study of the life cycle effects of unconventional gas drilling, there would be a repeal of the so-called Halliburton exemption, which really wasn't a Halliburton exemption. There's a long story there that's misconstrued by some environmental groups. But I would hope that that would be repealed, and so that like every other industry in the United States, when you're dealing with toxic or hazardous materials, proper reporting is done for the sake of the public. Why do we have the one industry that is closest to our water supply? Excuse me, those chemicals are never any closer to the water supply than when they go through it and when they're sitting on top of it. The one industry that's closest to our public water supply gets pass. It's inappropriate, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I really can't address that. I've read the law. It's a bit confusing. My understanding is that all the chemicals that are used on site are reported, but what isn't reported is the recipe used for the fracking, which goes down the well, but that this recipe constantly changes as different fluids are encountered. So it's really kind of hard to to provide the recipe a priori when you're doing a drilling operation, because you don't know what you're going to come up with depending on where you're drilling the well. There'll be very large differences in salinity and so forth, pretty close one well to the other. So I really don't fault the industry per se for not wanting to provide this information. I think they probably do, but they're trying to figure out, I imagine, how to do this in a way that makes sense. And as far as the so-called Halliburton Rule, I've heard all sorts of different views on what that meant. Whether they have to abide by the toxic waste disposal law or not. But I do know that the chemicals are listed on site and provided to the DEC, or DEP, Pennsylvania, but the formulas aren't. And I gather EPA is now forcing the companies to do the fracking to actually release them. I guess they're being forced, right? I understand that the companies are releasing what they're doing, with one notable exception that you might imagine, and there may be subpoena to do it. Yeah.
Thank you. If you can't hear me, let me know. The shale formations in question have been confined to layers between aquifers for millions of years. Are there experimental methods to test the hypothesis that horizontal hydrofracking conducted over vast geographic areas have no significant long-term effect on water movement between the aquifers?
Well, the term aquifer is kind of a difficult term, really. What we have are thick layers of shale with a couple units that contain very saline water, but with dry rock above. So we have a big thick sequence of dry rock, and at the very top you have the fractured zone, largely created by glaciation, with some geological processes before, and that's where the active flow is. It's up there in the upper 1,000 feet. If there were active flow deep, you wouldn't have the saline water. It would have been flushed out. So the water below 1,000 feet, certainly a mile down or 2 miles down, it's, from a hydraulic perspective, I can't imagine it being mobilized to ever get up into the shallow aquifers. It doesn't make sense to me. Where people have actually age dated that deep water, it's literally tens to hundreds of millions of years old. I mean, it was deposited with the rock and there it sits. So, I could see the possibility that if you had a well that was drilled as deep as, say, the Marcellus, or deeper, and it's an open hole and it's abandoned, and then someone's fracking some distance away, that there might be a conduit there, through a human-made conduit. But from the broader perspective over a long period of time, it really is inconceivable to me that those deep, dense, sailing waters that have been there for millions of years could be moved very far, even by the hydrofracking process itself, which is very, very short. Let me give you an example. 20, 30 years ago, I did a study where I actually determined natural hydrofracking done by a glacier in the central Midwest. There in middle of Iowa, people get water from a very deep aquifer, which is a real aquifer, and you can get a lot of water out. It's potable water, and it's overlain by hundreds and hundreds of feet, thousands of feet of shale. And when I looked at it, I discovered glacial meltwater in this deep aquifer thousands of feet down. And the only way we could get that down there is through vertical fracking done by a glacier a mile high for 2,000 years, being in place for 2,000 years, imposing 2 miles of pressure, enough to open that shale to allow that meltwater in. The glacier melted, there was no sand to hold the fractures in the shale open, so it sealed shut. And now we have a pretty good aquifer, a very good aquifer, that provides water for all of Iowa and part of Missouri and southern Minnesota. So having a frack job that lasts a few days compared to thousands of years to actually make something move that deep, I just don't think that's very, very, very implausible. I won't say it's impossible, but I just think it's so implausible I wouldn't worry about it.
Thank you.
So I'm glad Don said not impossible. I would go farther and say it's not only implausible, but there's a calculable probability of it, and I admit that that probability is still low. But here's the issue. Again, on my first slide, I said we're not here to talk about one frac stage on one well on one pad. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of frac stages in the area of southern New York. That's a regional disturbance that this formation has never seen. It's a man-made, a human-made regional disturbance of very large proportions. It's not one .22 caliber bullet shot into shale. It's hundreds of thousands of 500,000 gallon injections at 10,000 pounds per square inch, pressures that formation has not seen in 350 million years, and fluid volumes that the formation has not seen in 350 million years. Repeated again and again and again, 10 times on one well, maybe 16 wells on a pad, 160 times over a square mile. No one can convince me that if you do that kind of repetitive fatiguing of a shale formation, 160 times over a square mile, that you're not going to damage the formation in such a way that your initial conditions, that is, how you would do a calculation for potential flow upwards, have not significantly changed. The problem is now fundamentally different than you started with.
Thank you. In order to have time for the concluding remarks, this will be the last question, and I think it's a good one. I'm confused by some of the conflicting information I'm getting. How can I decide which side is more correct? Great question.
Who's first?
You're first.
Well, in academia, you always go with the taller guy. Did you ever notice that all presidents and deans are, and the worker bees are?
They have a full head of hair usually, too.
Exactly, yes.
Thank you.
Don, go ahead. How do we decide who's right?
I think there's a way, actually. And Tony will disagree, okay? The way is this. Let's say, God forbid, you get sick. You get a real bad illness, and say someone says it's a cancer. And that's what your doctor says. Most people here would want a second and a third opinion. You'd want to go to people who you trust, who have broad experience, and get a consensus view before you make a decision on what therapy you would have. I think climate change is one example. There are a lot of people out there, not a lot, there's a handful of people out there who are saying that humans have absolutely nothing to do about climate change. And put that in contrast with the thousands of climatologists who say humans are having something to do with climate change. And so I always look at what the large preponderance of scientists say. And I would ask you to ask how many hydrogeologists and hydrologists do you know who would argue that this will create a systemic problem, a large-scale problem, even with the uncertainties that Tony has so aptly brought up. Not everybody, just like an internist and a dentist, both go through medical school. You know, they have different skill sets, they have different experience. And I think the public needs to think about that. We both have different experiences, we both can bring something very important to this table. But check sources, check credentials, although credentials aren't everything, obviously, when you make decisions on these things. It'll go, regardless, from plumbing to law to medicine to science. Use your common sense, really. But try not to get caught up in the hype either way, of people advocating strong for one position or the other.
Would you like to add anything?
No, that's good.
I'll also say coming to forums like this, I think, is a great way, and to do what you actually just said, so I agree. Closing statements.
Is that done?
You can do it here if you'd like, or if you'd like to do it up there.
I'd first like to begin by first thanking you again, not only for coming, but enduring. Don and I were joking beforehand about, you put a couple professors on the stage and you don't really give us the full 50 minutes. You're still able to get a lot of hot air, and hopefully it wasn't mostly gaseous. But that last question was actually a good segue to one of the things I wanted to conclude with, and that is, by now you've probably gathered that the whole issue that we're talking about, which is not fracking, and it's not just water, and it's not just one well. It's the whole process of developing a region, southern New York, south central New York, for unconventional gas development from multiple shale deposits is a highly multidisciplinary issue. You have before you two of those disciplines, hydrogeology, rock mechanics. I'd also add that I know something about structural mechanics and pipelines too, but it's all in the same area. So we've given you two slices of the big picture. If you really want to know what to believe or how to believe, you've got to do more homework. You've got to listen to more people. Geologists, geochemists, geohydrologists, rock mechanics people, rock fracture mechanics people, structural engineers, cement people, pipeline people, mechanical engineers at the surface, transportation people, climatologists. All those topics were touched on tonight. So to form an educated opinion by which you can make a unbiased judgment about whether the risk to your health or your wealth is worth this development is the question to ask. Nothing can be done perfectly. Nothing can be done without risk. The question is not, can it be done without risk? The question is, what risk are you willing to accept? And to really answer that question well, we do not yet have enough data or enough information, because what New York State is faced with is unprecedented. What New York State is faced with has never happened anyplace else in the world. And we're asked to make a judgment now about what things might look like 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now based on only the beginnings, small bits of insight into what happened in Texas, what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Pennsylvania. But we're forced to make projections over large spaces and over long periods of time based on incomplete information. That's a formula for chaos in the engineering world, because slight perturbations, slight changes in any of these variables can result in totally different outcomes. So what we're facing is not a simple problem. It's not a simple choice to make. You shouldn't be making a decision right now. The good news is we're in New York State. We're wiser than most. We're the only political entity on the face of the earth right now that has said, wait. The only state, there are many countries that are already going full speed ahead. We're saying, wait. We're wiser than most. Let's use that time to acquire more information, acquire more data, and get to a position, hopefully sometime soon, where we can make informed risk assertions. So, final comment is keep learning, keep thinking, stay civil. No one person, me, Don, no other one person can tell you the whole story. So continue to engage as citizens of New York State, and do your best for yourselves, your families, and for the other citizens of the state. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you.
I'm going to take mine, just sit it down, because I want to be at the same elevation as Tony, so, yeah.
Thanks.
I think Tony was eloquent in really what he just said, that what concerns me most really about this whole debate about shale gas methane is in part the relative ease that people have in just hearing the same story that they want to hear. The web has allowed us to do this, right? People who are proponents of shale gas methane probably don't go to ProPublica or Shale Shock very often, and vice versa. And so there's almost a conscious decision in today's society to pick the side you want to be on and just get the news from that side. This could go across the spectrum, the political spectrum. I'm as concerned about global warming and the effects of that as Tony or anybody in this room. I teach it with the law school and at Maxwell School of Public Affairs. The folks I teach it with, one was the chief attorney for the World Wildlife Fund, National Defense, Environmental Defense Fund, and the other one helped write the IPCC. And so we're concerned about this. But I'm also a realist. I'm a realist in two ways. You know, I don't like to tilt against windmills, but I'd love to see a lot of windmills built. And I always ask the question, compared to what? And also I ask the question, I think everybody in the country, every region needs to take control and take ownership of both its waste and its energy if it has an opportunity. I think it's, for me, unconscionable that we're taking the tops off of mountains in Pennsylvania to avoid having potential problems of an unknown nature, but which may very well, as I think, not very, very large, in upstate New York. You know, I've worked with the coal industry in New York, and I've helped design landfills for true waste, the fly ash. And so I like to think that every region, every state, should take ownership and take the responsibility for its environment and for its energy, if they have the opportunity, and to take care of its own waste and not ship it out of its state, to avoid having the problem in their backyard. And I'm very firm on that. We have an opportunity in New York to generate part of our energy future. Granted, we have the issue that the gas goes into the general pipeline and we don't know where it's going, and maybe it's going to Norway. But perhaps part of that economic picture is that we may not have to import other energy sources from outside. I'm not an energy expert, but it just strikes me that if we have the opportunity to contribute to even global energy, that there's some measure of responsibility. I agree that there are some uncertainties, and I agree with some of what Tony said regarding how we can address these uncertainties, do a bit more geological work when we start siting these wells and so forth. But I can say that I know of very, very few hydrologists or hydrogeologists who would agree that fracking would do what some people are arguing will do, even on the large scale. There's a difference in opinion. But most of all, you as citizens have to take the initiative to look at both sides and to ask the questions. I've gotten lots of questions through email from quite a few people in this room who've identified themselves to me, and I freely will spend the time giving you my take, provide references and so forth, while recognizing the uncertainties. So I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I applaud Cortland for putting this on. It's been great to meet Tony. We've only seen each other from distance, and who knows, maybe we'll do this again sometime. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Really briefly before you head out, I just wanted to thank the audience. I thought the questions were terrific, and I thank you for your decorum. Also, I'd like to generally thank the organizers. I also need to direct you that there will be information at the tables as you leave the auditorium. I'd like to thank the time keepers, also the question sorters, and all the people who collected questions. And if we could give one round of applause additionally to Sheila Cohn, who organized, spearheaded this event. So we very much appreciate it. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again for
my
attending.
students who came here,
Students as well.
probably around 10, 15 minutes, I'll meet you at the van, then we'll go have supper.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Yeah. That's right.